The elevator doors were about to close. Emma Richardson stood inside the metal box, her cardboard box of personal belongings held against her chest like a shield, when she heard it. That voice. The one that had been slicing through her chest for 6 years without mercy. My office. Now. No. Please. No softness. No explanation. The same tone Victoria used in quarterly earnings calls to make shareholders nervous, to make competitors realize they were outmatched. Emma's breath caught. The doors had already begun their automated seal, that slow hydraulic sigh that meant escape, but her hand moved against her own will and pressed the button to reopen them. Of course it did. After 6 years, her body still obeyed Victoria Sterling without question. She turned. There was Victoria in the hallway, perfectly tailored in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, her silver-streaked hair pulled back with the precision of someone who controlled everything. Every angle, every impression. But her jaw was clenched in a way that made her look fragile, like bone stretched too thin over the architecture of rage or grief, and Emma couldn't tell which. Their eyes met for less than a second, just long enough for Emma to see something fracture behind Victoria's carefully maintained composure. Then Victoria turned and walked toward her office, without waiting to see if Emma would follow. Of course she would follow. She was always following. The small box of 6 years felt heavier in her arms now. A coffee mug that someone had given her years ago as a joke, a framed photo of her college roommates, a jade plant that Victoria had. Emma forced the thought away. She stepped out of the elevator. Her sneakers made soft sounds against the polished concrete flooring of the 35th floor, designed to evoke minimalism and success in equal measure, all glass walls and filtered light from the Charles River far below. The morning sun was hitting the water at that particular angle that made it look like silver liquid, breaking into fragments. Beautiful, empty. Victoria's office door was already open, that gesture of both invitation and finality. Emma walked through. Victoria was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her back to Emma, her shoulders tight. She didn't turn around immediately. The door closed behind Emma with a soft click. Then there was silence. 3 minutes of it. Emma knew because she counted. Her anxiety had developed this habit years ago. When Victoria's mood shifted in unpredictable ways, Emma had learned to count her breaths, to measure time in heartbeats, as if quantifying the pain might make it manageable. 60 seconds of Victoria not moving, not speaking, just standing with her hands gripped together so tightly that Emma could see the white of her knuckles from across the room. Then Victoria tried to say something, opened her mouth, closed it. The sound she made was almost a laugh, except it had nothing to do with humor. It was the sound of something inside her breaking. "You're leaving," Victoria said finally. And it wasn't a question. Her voice was rough in a way that Emma had never heard it before, like gravel under silk. Emma couldn't remember the last time she had heard Victoria sound like she was struggling. This woman who could present to the FDA with the confidence of someone who had already won. This woman who could fire people and make it sound like a kindness, a logical necessity, nothing personal. But that voice now, broken, raw, it sounded personal in a way that terrified Emma. "The letter is on your desk," Emma said carefully. She had rehearsed this. She had prepared for disappointment, for anger about losing a good employee, for questions about why she hadn't given notice in person first. She had braced for Victoria's version of professionalism, that cool regard that had been the texture of their entire relationship. She had not prepared for whatever this was. Victoria finally turned, and Emma saw that her eyes were wet. Not tears yet. Victoria was still fighting them, still maintaining control in the only way she had ever known how. But the evidence was there, shining at the edges. 6 years, Victoria said, and the tremor in her voice made Emma's entire body go rigid. "You've been here for 6 years." Emma wanted to say something, but she didn't know what. The truth was complicated and lived inside her like a second skeleton, and she couldn't let it out. Not now, not ever. She had decided that 3 weeks ago when she accepted the position at Brennan and Associates, 2 miles away, a different company, a different future. "It's a good opportunity," Emma said, falling back on the script she had prepared. "I think it's time for me to grow in a new environment, work on different projects, expand my— Stop, Victoria interrupted, and her voice cut through the room like something breaking. She raised a hand, and that gesture, so small, so human, was the thing that finally broke Emma's composure. She felt her throat tighten. She felt the beginning of something she had been holding back for years trying to surface. Don't do the professional routine with me. Not now. Not after. Victoria didn't finish. She just shook her head, and it was such a lost gesture that Emma almost reached out to her without thinking. She stopped herself. I found out this morning, Victoria continued. I came in early to review something for the board meeting, and your resignation was sitting right there on my desk, like a bullet that had already been fired. Catherine came into my office after she saw me standing there, just standing there looking at your letter, and she told me I was an idiot. Those were her exact words. You're an idiot, Vic. A brilliant idiot. But an idiot nonetheless. Emma felt something shift. Catherine knew. Of course Catherine knew. Catherine had always known things that were impossible for her to know, and she had never said anything, had just let Victoria and Emma exist in whatever tortured silence they had constructed between themselves. I can't do this anymore, Victoria said, and it came out like a confession extracted under interrogation, like the last thing she had been holding back with all her strength. I've been trying to do the right thing for 6 years. I've been trying to be professional and appropriate and a good boss and everything that I'm supposed to be, and I can't watch you leave. Not without you knowing. She ran both hands through her hair, a gesture so unlike her practiced control that it looked almost violent. You have to know. But Emma was already moving toward the door. This was too big. This was the thing that lived behind every professional interaction, every closed-door meeting, every time Victoria had stepped back from Emma, even when Emma wanted her to move closer. This was the thing that Emma had finally accepted she could not have, and she had made peace with that acceptance. She had made it all the way to the elevator to escape it, and now Victoria was pulling her back into the gravity of it with nothing but her voice and the truth that was spilling out like blood from a wound that should have been healed years ago. I have to go, Emma said. I have to. I need to clear out my desk and— But she knew it was a lie. Her desk was already cleared. She had been careful about that. Careful about not letting anyone see how much of 6 years had accumulated there, how many traces of herself she had left in that space. Why? Victoria asked, and the word was so simple, so direct, that it shattered everything. Why are you leaving? Not the job. I understand the job. I've been expecting you to grow beyond us for a while. But why now? Why like this, where you didn't even tell me yourself? Where you just left a letter like I'm already dead, Emma thought. Like I'm already gone and you're just saying goodbye to a ghost. Because I can't stay, Emma said, and she turned back to face Victoria, because if she was going to say this, she was going to say it with her eyes open. I can't stay in a place where I'm close to someone She stopped. The words were climbing up her throat, trying to escape. She pushed them back down. I need something real, not this half-life where we work together and pretend that what I feel doesn't exist. I can't keep pretending for you, Victoria. I'm 34 years old. I wanted to have a life that wasn't just about being in the same building as someone who barely sees me. The cruelty of that last part, and it was cruel, it was deliberately chosen because Emma needed Victoria to let her go. Victoria needed to understand that this wasn't something that could be negotiated or reasoned through. This was a rupture. This was an ending that had been coming for 6 years, ever since the day Emma had walked into an interview and sat across from Victoria Sterling and felt her entire world realign. Victoria absorbed that like a physical blow. Emma watched it happen in real time, the moment the words landed, the moment Victoria understood that she hadn't just been passive in this story. She had been actively, deliberately, keeping Emma at a distance. All those times Victoria had insisted that Emma lead projects, all those moments when Victoria had stepped back and disappeared, all those professional courtesies that now looked like something else entirely. They weren't professionalism. They were terror. They were Victoria terrified of the same thing Emma had been terrified of, and both of them had chosen silence over risk. I'm sorry, Victoria said quietly. I'm sorry. I know I'm too late. I know that. She turned back to the window, and now she was crying openly, not hiding it anymore. The morning light caught the tears on her face and made them look silver, like the river behind her, fragmenting, breaking apart, impossible to put back together. But I need you to hear this anyway. I need you to know that for the last 6 years, the only thing that made this job bearable, the only thing that made any of this worth doing, was knowing that you would come through that door, that I would hear your voice in meetings, that I would get to see your face across a conference table and pretend that it was all strictly professional. That was the lie I told myself, that we could keep this compartmentalized, that if I just maintained enough distance, I could be your boss and also be someone who... She couldn't finish. She couldn't say it. And Emma understood that Victoria had just confessed everything she could confess without completely dismantling herself. Emma stood in the middle of Victoria's office, with her small cardboard box of 6 years held against her chest, and she made a choice. Not the choice she had planned to make, not the professional exit strategy she had rehearsed in her apartment, alone, practicing the words in front of the mirror. This was a different choice entirely. She set the box down on Victoria's desk, right next to her resignation letter, right there in the space between them, that had always been too far and also too close. I need 3 months, Emma said, to transition the department properly, to find someone to replace me, to... She stopped. She didn't have a full sentence for what the real reason was. 3 months, she repeated. And then we figure out if this is something that's real, or if it's just something we've been telling ourselves because we were too scared to walk away. Victoria looked at her like she was looking at something that had been lost and was now being returned, and that expression, vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once, was worth the 6 years of silence. It had to be. It was the only justification Emma had for staying long enough to find out if they were real. But first, there was a company to exist in. There were colleagues to face. There was a love story hiding inside a biotech headquarters in Boston, and it was about to become very, very complicated. Before we go any further with this story, if you're following along, if this kind of careful, patient ache is the kind of love story that matters to you, hit like and subscribe. There are stories like this one that deserve to be witnessed. The ones about the people brave enough to finally speak. Now, let me take you back to where this began. Back to the beginning of 6 years. To the first time Victoria Sterling saw Emma Richardson walk through a door and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The hiring process had been typical for Silvergen Biotech. Dozens of candidates, most of them overqualified, most of them looking to burnish their resumes on their way to bigger things. Victoria had stopped paying close attention to the parade of faces by the time the third set of interviews rolled around. She was the CEO of a thriving company in one of the most competitive biotech markets in the world. She didn't have time for nuance in hiring. She had delegated the HR decisions to her leadership team years ago, had learned to trust other people's judgment because she couldn't afford to second-guess every personnel decision. It was a system that worked, it was efficient, it was safe. Then Emma Richardson walked into a conference room during the final round of interviews, and Victoria made the mistake of asking her a direct question instead of letting the interview process happen around her like background noise. Emma had been applying for the position of Director of Human Resources, a critical role, one that required someone who could navigate the tension between employee welfare and corporate bottom line. Someone who would need to fire people when the quarterly numbers demanded it, but who could do so with a kind of grace that kept the company's reputation intact. Someone who could enforce policies while making people feel seen. It was an impossible job, which meant the ideal candidate would be someone who was okay with impossible. Emma had come into that room with her qualifications lined up perfectly. 15 years of HR experience, a master's degree in organizational psychology, a track record of building strong cultures at other organizations. She was articulate and professional, and everything a CEO would want in someone managing personnel. And then Victoria had asked her, "What's the hardest thing you've ever had to do in your career?" Most candidates gave a rehearsed answer. Someone laid off a whole department. Someone reorganized a hostile workplace. Someone navigated a complex discrimination lawsuit. Professional struggles, quantified and resolved. Emma had taken a breath, and then she had told the truth. Once, Emma said, I had to fire a woman who had been my mentor. She had been at the company for 20 years, and she was no longer performing at the level the organization needed. It was the right decision for the business, but it broke my heart. I cried in my car for an hour afterward, and I realized that the hardest part wasn't making the professional decision. The hardest part was accepting that sometimes doing the right thing means hurting someone you care about, and you can't let that hurt prevent you from doing what's right. You just have to carry it. Victoria remembered thinking, no one says things like that in an interview, and then she remembered thinking, this is exactly the person we need, and then she remembered thinking, this is dangerous. She had known, right there in that first encounter, that Emma Richardson was going to change something. Not because Emma was perfect. Victoria had quickly learned that Emma was deeply imperfect, that she was too trusting in her early days, that she sometimes made decisions based on what she felt was right, rather than what was strategically optimal. But there was something about her, something about the way she moved through a room and tried to see people, really see them, that made Victoria want to protect her from this company. She wanted to protect her from the system they were all trapped in, the machine that ground up idealism and spit out pragmatism. Instead, Victoria had hired her. And for 6 years, that decision had been both the best and worst thing Victoria had ever done. The first year was manageable. Emma was still proving herself, still learning the landscape of the company, still maintaining professional boundaries that made it easy for Victoria to pretend that this was just a successful hiring decision. Victoria had built her career on decisions like this: brilliant people, impressive people, the kind of professionals who excelled in high-pressure environments. Emma was just one of those people, one of many, except she wasn't. Emma was completely, entirely, uniquely Emma, and Victoria was completely, entirely falling in love with her. The second year, Victoria started the distance. She began insisting that Emma run more meetings without her present. She made a point of not being available for casual conversations. When Emma would stop by her office to discuss department strategy, Victoria would keep the interaction brief, would cut off the natural flow of conversation before it could drift into anything more personal. She told herself this was professional. She told herself she was protecting both of them. What she was really doing was protecting herself from the moment when Emma would realize that Victoria wanted more than a working relationship, and then Emma would leave, and Victoria would have lost her. The third year, Catherine Wells, who had been Victoria's friend and confidant for the better part of 30 years, who had been the only person Victoria had confided in after her divorce years earlier, finally confronted her about it. They were having drinks at a cocktail bar on the waterfront, and Catherine had just watched Victoria decline an invitation to join her and some other executives for dinner because she knew Emma might be there. "You're in love with her," Catherine had said, matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. Not as a question, as an observation so obvious that she was surprised it had taken her this long to state it out loud. "I'm not," Victoria had said immediately, and the lie tasted like ash. "We have a professional relationship, and I'm protecting that relationship by maintaining appropriate boundaries. It's called leadership." "It's called cowardice," Catherine had replied. She was drinking a martini with a precision that suggested she'd had this conversation mapped out before they arrived. "You've spent your entire life building things, Victoria. This company, your reputation, your legacy. You've broken barriers. You've made women in science a possibility in ways they weren't before. And you're afraid of one thing, actually letting someone in." "I can't," Victoria had said, and her voice had broken in a way that told Catherine everything she needed to know. "If I tell her, and she doesn't feel the same way, then I lose her entirely. And I can't lose her. Not right now, maybe not ever." "And what happens when you keep this up for another 6 years?" Catherine had asked. "What happens when you're both old, and you never took the risk? You're going to spend your life wondering what if. That's worse than losing her." But Victoria had maintained her distance anyway. because she was good at denying herself things. She had denied herself romantic partnerships with men because they wanted her to be smaller. She had denied herself a family because a family required vulnerability. She had denied herself a personal life outside of work because work was the only place where she could control outcomes. She was excellent at denial. What she wasn't prepared for was Emma deciding to deny herself as well. For 6 years, Emma had been the warm one in their exchanges. She was the one who remembered that Victoria had mentioned trouble sleeping and would bring her sleep gummies from the natural food store. She was the one who sent Victoria funny memes because she knew Victoria had a dry sense of humor, but was too formal to share memes with most people. She was the one who fought for employees who Victoria was ready to write off as problems, and she did it with such clarity of conviction that Victoria eventually learned to trust Emma's judgment completely. She would have done anything Emma asked of her, which was precisely why she maintained the distance. Because letting Emma know that would be letting Emma know everything. Catherine had tried multiple times to convince Victoria to just say something, anything, to let Emma know that she wasn't crazy for sensing something underneath the professional veneer. But Victoria was terrified. She had built an empire through control, and the one thing she couldn't control was what Emma would say if Victoria finally told her the truth. So they had coexisted in the company for 6 years, with Emma slowly building a quiet heartbreak around her, with Victoria slowly building a quiet life of denial around hers. They had met for strategy sessions and pretended professionalism. They had made decisions together about company direction and pretended that wasn't the most intimate thing either of them had experienced in years. They had worked side by side and kept their distance with the precision of people trying not to disturb a thing they both knew was fragile. Emma had held on as long as she could, but 3 weeks ago, the breaking point had come in the form of an email. Subject line: career opportunity. Brennan and Associates was a newer, smaller firm, only 300 employees compared to Silvergen's 1,000. It was less prestigious than Silvergen, but it was growing fast, and they had contacted Emma directly with an offer for a position as their new head of people operations. Salary was slightly higher, equity was solid, and the role would give Emma the space to design an entire department from scratch, to build a culture from the ground up instead of managing an existing one. Objectively, it was an excellent opportunity. Subjectively, it was an escape route, and Emma had recognized it as such the moment she opened the email. She had spent a week trying to convince herself not to take it. She had told herself that she was running away, that it was cowardly to leave, just because she couldn't handle unrequited feelings for her boss. She had told herself that she was being dramatic, that professional attraction and emotional enmeshment were not the same thing, and that she should be able to work in close proximity to Victoria Sterling without it destroying her from the inside. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. She had spent 6 years in love with someone who did not know she was alive outside of professional contexts. She had spent 6 years watching Victoria move through the world with that controlled, perfect exterior, and she had spent 6 years being kept at a distance that was both tantalizingly close and impossibly far. She could watch Victoria laugh at a joke Catherine made and feel her heart break because she would never be the person who made Victoria laugh like that. She could sit in meetings and listen to Victoria's strategic brilliance and feel despair because that brilliance was being used to maintain distance between them. She could exist in proximity to Victoria and feel loneliness that was actually more acute than if Victoria had been completely inaccessible. So 3 weeks ago, Emma had emailed back and said yes. She had asked for a week to think about it, which she didn't need. She was already gone in her mind. And then she had spent that week figuring out how to make the transition, and how to have a conversation with Victoria that would be professional and kind and wouldn't expose the fact that the real reason Emma was leaving was because she couldn't keep loving someone who didn't love her back. She had written the resignation letter at her kitchen table late at night. She had rewritten it 7 times. She had tried to make it sound like a career move, like it was all about new challenges and growth, like it was the kind of decision you made when you were ready for the next chapter. She had deleted every line that came close to the truth. In the end, the letter she wrote was professional and brief and completely empty of what she actually felt. She had printed it out and put it in an envelope and brought it to the office the next morning, planning to place it on Victoria's desk early in the day and then immediately start the transition conversations. The plan was to keep their interaction brief and professional, and to avoid any kind of emotional entanglement that would make the next 2 weeks impossible. What she hadn't planned for was Victoria arriving at the office before Emma had finished executing the plan. What she hadn't planned for was Victoria intercepting her at the elevator. What she hadn't planned for was Victoria's voice cracking when she said Emma's name, and what she absolutely could not have planned for was Victoria's confession, that raw, broken honesty that Victoria had kept contained for 6 years because she was Victoria Sterling, and Victoria Sterling did not fall apart. She did not voice needs. She did not risk. She did not believe in things that couldn't be controlled or quantified or strategically managed. And yet here she was, in her corner office overlooking the Charles River, with tears on her face and the carefully constructed walls of a lifetime crumbling around her. Emma had spent years imagining what she would do if Victoria ever said something like this. She had imagined herself saying no. She had imagined herself saying that it was too late, that Victoria had missed her chance, that you couldn't keep someone at a distance for 6 years and then expect them to just absorb your feelings and remain loyal. She had imagined herself staying strong and walking away, and proving to herself that she was capable of prioritizing her own well-being over the gravitational pull of unrequited love. But when Victoria had finally spoken, when Emma had finally heard her say words that came close to what Emma had been feeling all along, something had shifted. Emma realized that Victoria had been in pain too. Victoria had been keeping Emma at a distance, not because Victoria didn't care, but because Victoria was terrified. The distance was protection. It was Victoria's only tool for controlling something that couldn't be controlled. Emma had asked for 3 months. She had asked for time to see if what was between them was real, or if it was a story they had both been telling themselves. She had asked for a chance to transition the department, because walking away from 6 years of work needed to be done with intention. But the real reason she asked for 3 months was because she needed to know if Victoria could meet her halfway. If Victoria could move toward her, the way Victoria had kept Emma at a distance. If Victoria could be brave enough to choose vulnerability over control. 3 months was not a long time in the context of 6 years of silenced love, but it was enough time to build something, or enough time to confirm that what they had was built on proximity and desperation, rather than something that could actually survive on its own. In those first days after Victoria's confession, things were strange in ways that Emma couldn't quite articulate to anyone else. She went to work and she saw Victoria in meetings, and there was this new rawness between them now, this exposed thing that had been invisible before. Victoria still maintained professional distance in the shared spaces. They weren't going to suddenly start showing affection in front of the team, and Emma appreciated that Victoria understood it was important to keep certain boundaries. But in private moments, things were different. Victoria asked Emma questions about her life outside of work. Victoria listened to the answers. Victoria made it clear that she saw Emma, actually saw her, not as a director of HR or as a brilliant professional, but as a person with dreams and fears, and a whole interior life that Victoria had been ignoring for 6 years. In the second week, Victoria did something unexpected. She asked Emma to grab dinner with her, under the pretense of discussing transition plans. They went to a restaurant that was close to both their offices. Nothing fancy, just a place where they could eat without too many people paying attention to them. And over food that they barely touched, Victoria told Emma what it had been like for her, what it had been like to wake up every day and know that the one thing she wanted most was in the building, was close enough to reach out and touch, but that reaching out would destroy everything she'd built. "I was supposed to be above this," Victoria said. She was pushing her food around her plate, not eating. "When you're a woman in science, when you've had to fight for every position, when you've had to prove that you're twice as good to get half the credit, you start to believe that your feelings are a liability. You start to think that wanting something, really wanting it, means you're weak. And I couldn't afford to be weak. Not then, not when we were building the company. Not when I was trying to prove that a woman could run a biotech firm and manage investors and earn billions of dollars. So I pushed it down. I convinced myself that I was being professional. What I was really doing was dying slowly while trying to maintain the illusion of control. I would have said yes, Emma told her. 6 years ago, if you'd said something, I would have said yes immediately. I was already gone on you by the second month. By the end of the first year, I couldn't even imagine a future that didn't include you in it somehow. Victoria absorbed that. She reached across the table, and for the first time in their professional relationship, she didn't pull back. She let her hand rest on top of Emma's. It was just a touch, just skin to skin, but it was enough to confirm that this was real, that what had been happening between them for 6 years wasn't all in their heads, that Victoria's distance and Emma's longing weren't products of imagination. They were real responses to a real force between them, a real connection that had been trying to exist despite all the obstacles both of them had placed in its way. "I'm sorry it took me so long," Victoria said. "I'm sorry I waited," Emma replied. "I should have said something years ago. I should have risked it instead of just accepting the way things were." They sat there in that restaurant, two women in their 30s and 50s, holding hands across a table, finally being honest about the thing that had organized their entire professional relationship. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like grief. It felt like mourning all the years they had lost, all the moments they could have had, all the versions of this that might have been possible if either one of them had been braver, sooner. The third week of those 3 months was when things became complicated in a different way. Emma had begun the process of recruiting her replacement. She was training a candidate from outside the company, a woman named Priya who was smart and organized and would be good for the role. And in working with Priya, in watching her navigate the company systems and the corporate culture, Emma realized something that had been sitting underneath everything. Victoria wasn't the problem, or rather, Victoria wasn't the only problem. The whole system was built in a way that rewarded distance. It rewarded people who could keep their emotions compartmentalized, who could make cold decisions without letting personal attachment complicate things, who could look at human beings as assets rather than as people with full inner lives. The distance that Victoria maintained with Emma had been learned from the same environment that demanded it. And now Emma was about to leave, and Victoria was about to continue existing in that environment, and neither one of them was going to be healed by a romantic resolution because the wound was bigger than just the two of them. It wasn't until the fourth week that Emma understood what the real work had to be. She was sitting in a diversity committee meeting, something she had been leading for the past few years, when someone made a comment about how important it was for employees to leave their personal lives at the door. It was a small comment, the kind of thing people say all the time, the kind of cultural norm that nobody questions. And Emma felt something shift. She had been leaving her personal life at the door for 6 years. She had been compartmentalizing her love for Victoria, putting it in a box, taking it out only when she was alone in her apartment at night, and then putting it back away before she came into the office. And that compartmentalization had been killing her slowly, creating a schism inside her between the Emma who was professional and competent and the Emma who was deeply, achingly human. She thought about all the employees at Silvergen who were probably doing the same thing, who were probably hiding parts of themselves to fit into a system that demanded uniformity, who were probably creating the same kind of internal divide that she and Victoria had been creating, and she realized that the victory of Victoria finally confessing her love was only the beginning. The real victory would be if they could change the system in a way that didn't require people to hide themselves to succeed. It was that realization that made her decide to stay only the 3 months and then leave anyway. Not because she was running away from Victoria anymore, but because she needed to grow in an environment where she could be whole. She needed to build something new, somewhere new, where she could bring all of herself to her work. And she needed to know that Victoria understood that love sometimes means letting someone go, even when you want to keep them close. In the 6th week, Emma told Victoria about her decision. They were in Victoria's apartment, a sleek, minimalist space that seemed to have been designed by someone trying to create an environment free of personality or feeling. They were sitting on a sectional couch that probably cost more than Emma's entire wardrobe, and Emma had just finished explaining that she was going to keep her commitment to Brennan and Associates. That she was still leaving, even though everything had changed between them. Victoria didn't cry. She sat very still for a long time, processing what Emma was saying. "I understand," she said finally. "I don't like it, but I understand. You need to be somewhere where you're not just valued for your work. You need to be somewhere where being yourself is an asset, not something you have to manage. I took that away from you. I kept you at a distance for so long that I think I made it harder for you to believe that you were worth the risk." "That's not fair to yourself," Emma said. "I made choices too." "I could have said something. I could have risked it. Instead, I waited. I built my whole life around you, and I didn't even know I was doing it until it was too late." "Is it too late?" Victoria asked. There was something hopeful in her voice, but also something terrified. She was asking a question that didn't have a simple yes or no answer. "No," Emma said, "but it's complicated. We can't just go back to normal. We can't pretend that what we feel isn't real, but we also can't just exist in the space we've been in. Something has to change. I have to change. You have to change. And I don't know if that's possible while I'm still working here, while you're still the CEO, and I'm still just someone who reports to you." They made love that night for the first time, not as a solution to the problem, but as an acknowledgement that the problem was real, that their feelings were real, that what had been living between them for 6 years was real enough to finally touch, to finally speak out loud, to finally make concrete in their bodies. It was tender and careful and tinged with sadness, because they both knew it didn't solve anything. It was a punctuation mark on a chapter that was ending, not the beginning of a new one. The 7th week brought a complication that Emma hadn't anticipated. One of the junior HR managers, a queer woman named Devon who had been working at Silvergen for about 2 years, came to Emma's office to tell her that she was struggling at the company. She was doing good work, but she felt like she couldn't be herself at Silvergen. She felt like she had to minimize parts of who she was to fit in, to be taken seriously, to not be seen as someone whose identity was a liability rather than an asset. Emma listened to her, and she heard herself in that story. She heard the younger version of herself who had been trying to prove something, who had been trying to be professional enough to earn respect. And she made a decision that surprised her. She told Devon the truth. Not the whole truth. She didn't share details about Victoria, but she told Devon that she had been in love with someone at the company, that she had spent 6 years keeping that part of herself hidden, and that she was leaving because she had realized that hiding that fundamental part of who you were was a high price to pay for a paycheck. Devon didn't say much in response, but her eyes filled with tears, and in the following days, Emma began to notice something shifting. Devon was more open in meetings. She started mentioning her girlfriend in casual conversation. She started pushing back when she thought policies were unjust, and it seemed like her visibility was giving other people permission to be more visible too. In the 8th week, something unexpected happened. Catherine Wells came to see Emma in her office. Catherine was Victoria's closest friend, had been for years, and Emma had always maintained a careful distance from Catherine because she was worried that Catherine knew, that somehow Victoria's feelings were printed all over Emma's face, and Catherine could read it. But this time, Catherine came in with purpose, and she closed the door behind her. "Victoria's going to step back," Catherine said without preamble. "After you leave, she's going to hand over the CEO role to me. She's been planning it for a while, but she accelerated the timeline after she told you how she felt." Emma didn't know what to do with that information. "She loves this company," Emma said. "She built it from nothing. She loves you more," Catherine said simply. "And I think she's finally understanding that running a company the way she's been running it, compartmentalized, controlled, everyone kept at a distance, it's poison. Just for her and you, for the entire organization. So I'm going to run it differently. I'm going to build a company where people can be whole, where being queer isn't something you hide, where having a personal life isn't a liability. And Victoria's going to step back, and she's going to figure out what she wants her life to actually look like when she's not trying to prove anything to anyone." Hinquade. In the final week, Emma had a conversation with Victoria that they should have had 6 years earlier. Victoria had told her, "I don't need you to stay, but I need you to know that what you're doing matters. You leaving, you choosing yourself, you being brave about who you are, it's changing this place. It's changing me. So thank you for not settling for the way things were." Emma moved to Brennan and Associates on a Monday morning. She had a new team, a new building, a new city to explore. But she still lived in Boston, and Victoria still lived in Boston, and they had decided to try to build something real. Not in secret, not hidden behind professionalism, not compartmentalized into a box that they would keep closed at work and open only at home. They were going to try to build something honest. In the months that followed, something extraordinary happened at Silvergen. With Victoria stepping back and Catherine taking over, the culture began to shift. New policies were implemented about workplace inclusion. The Diversity Committee, which Devon now helped lead, began to have real power to shape company decisions. Employees who had been hiding parts of themselves began to be more open. One of the senior scientists came out as trans. Two members of the engineering team who had been keeping their relationship secret began to hold hands in the hallway. The systems that Victoria and Emma had been operating inside, the systems that demanded they hide themselves, began to crack. Not dramatically, but persistently, creating space for people to exist more fully. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Corporate culture doesn't change overnight, and there were still moments when old patterns reasserted themselves, when people reverted to hiding, when the pressure to be professional and compartmentalized and distant became strong again. But something had fundamentally shifted, and it had shifted because two women had finally chosen honesty over control, even when honesty was terrifying. Victoria and Emma's relationship became something that wasn't quite a secret anymore, but wasn't quite openly displayed either. They would go to company events together, and people would understand. They would have dinner in restaurants where people from the company might see them, and there was no longer a performance happening, no longer a distance being maintained. They were just two women who were in love, who had waited 6 years to say it, and who were now building something real in the space where honesty lived. 6 months after Emma left Silvergen, Catherine called her. The company had just launched a mentorship program for LGBTQ+ employees, and they wanted Emma to be one of the mentors, connecting people from the outside who could help guide people through the process of being more authentically themselves in professional spaces. It was a perfect role for Emma, and it meant that in a way, she was still part of the Silvergen community, still helping to transform it, but from a different position, with a different relationship to power. And Victoria, who had stepped down from the CEO role and was now serving on the board, who had finally allowed herself to have a personal life that existed alongside her professional one, who had learned to separate her worth from her productivity and control, would attend events where she saw Emma mentoring someone, and she would feel something that she hadn't felt in years. She felt hope. She felt like maybe all those 6 years of waiting, all that silent suffering, all that distance, had been the price of learning what it actually meant to love someone enough to let them become who they needed to be. If you've made it this far into this story, you already know it's different from the ones you usually hear. You've been in that office with Victoria when she couldn't speak. You've felt Emma's heartbreak as she walked toward the elevator. You've understood that sometimes the people we love have to leave for us to build something real with them. And if there's someone in your life who you've been keeping at a distance because you're afraid of losing them, if there's a truth you haven't spoken because honesty feels like too much risk, I want you to think about what the cost of that silence is. Not just to them, but to yourself. Not just today, but over a lifetime. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Like it if it made you feel something true. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this one. Stories about people who chose honesty, who chose vulnerability, who chose to be fully themselves even when the systems around them demanded otherwise. The ending of this story isn't about whether Victoria and Emma lived happily ever after. That's not what desfecho colectivo means. It means that their willingness to risk, their willingness to be honest, their willingness to choose love over control, that changed something